Hey guys, welcome to the Editing Bard, the channel that brings you writing tips that make sense. I have been on a large kick lately doing interviews with former students, current clients, and pretty much anybody else that I know who wants to get online and talk with me. So I am very excited to introduce you guys to a client of mine who is currently working on her first nonfiction novel. And I've had the opportunity to be working with her since October of last year. And it has been an incredible journey, a lot of which we'll be talking about during the stream. And I see wifey is here. And so I'm going to throw it over to her to introduce herself and a little bit about kind of what her book is.
Awesome. Cool. So yeah, good to be here, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Carly Newberg, and I'm the author of Good Enough, which is soon to be published. I've been working with Steven, like you said, since October. And yeah, I also create content for both the website and the Instagram Believing Beautiful, which I started a couple years ago. And I also just recently graduated from college with a bachelor degree in applied health and fitness and communications. And after graduation, decided that I wanted to go home to Eastern Oregon for a little bit and spend some time with family and just really get serious about finishing this book. It's you'll hear probably later on, but it's been a very long, drawn-out process, especially trying to do it on my own. And when I moved over to Eastern Oregon, that's actually when I met Steven, and we started working together. So I wasn't really sure about going home and taking some time off from work and school after I graduated, but it ended up being a very big blessing in disguise. And yeah, it really just gave me some direction and guidance on how to get this book finished. And now we're near the end. My book has a lot of different messages throughout it, but it is a book about learning to believe beautiful through trauma, through life and disorder. I share a lot of my own personal experiences in it around family, around friends, faith, and an eating disorder that I developed in my teenage years and then later recovered from in my adult years. And my goal at the end of every single chapter and just my motivation behind every experience that I share is to help anyone who has or who currently is struggling with disordered eating, anyone who has dealt with body dysmorphia or just negative body image, and then those who at any point in their life have felt unworthy or just unloved. And it's also a book for those who maybe haven't experienced any of that, but just want to learn more about what someone in those shoes goes through. So yeah, that's just a little bit about me.
Yeah, love it. So we got comments coming in already. There's wifey. Dal, hello, welcome.
Hi.
The dancing bardess, she yeets herself into chat. She's very excited. I know them. We hang out on Discord. And cause all sorts of chaos on the poor Discord hosts. all sorts of chaos. And then Alexandra, love your message.
Best friend.
Hello, best friend. So I was actually talking with my friends in Discord leading up to this stream, actually. Telling them about it and just kind of sharing that it's been an inspiration for me as well, just reading through the first draft of the novel, the now mostly completed second draft of it, and just seeing the transformation that has taken place in not only your writing but in you as an author. But just the story is one that is just so powerful because it's one of those things, and you and I have talked about it, is that people don't really talk about eating disorder. And if they do, there's a lot of misconceptions floating around about eating disorders, about how they work, how they affect people. Because I know that for me, when I think of anorexia, I think of people who are wafer thin all bones. But that wasn't the case. So what I'd like to start off with as like a first question is, why don't you give us a little bit of background on kind of what led you up to writing this book, and what was some of the experiences that you went through?
Yeah. Well, like you said, eating disorders are something that aren't talked about very often. I think that it's becoming more common for people to take note of them and to realize that they're a real thing. And it's not just about the motivation for someone isn't just to be skinny. There's a lot more happening underneath the surface. And I think I reached a point where my book didn't actually start out it wasn't a book I was writing for people who had struggled with an eating disorder. My eating disorder was part of the story, but it wasn't, that wasn't the driving focus, and it wasn't the audience I was really speaking to. And that wasn't something I really even came to understand. I didn't start realizing that that's who I wanted to talk to, and that's who I was so passionate about writing this book for, until way later on in the process. And that's one of the beautiful things about going through multiple drafts, is you start to find out what story you're trying to tell and what audience you're speaking to. And I just think that, I spent so long hiding myself from the world, and there were a lot of times in my eating disorder where I didn't think I was sick because I wasn't skinny enough, or I thought I wasn't skinny enough, or I just didn't think that my idea of an eating disorder was something I was struggling with, because my idea of what an eating disorder was so construed and just morphed into something that wasn't realistic. And so realizing that, and through my recovery, realizing why I was actually restricting food, and because I dealt with anorexia and bulimia and a little bit of exercise addiction. It was kind of, I just fell in the middle of all three of those. There are multiple different eating disorders, but my motivation for writing the book was I wanted this to be a space where I could talk freely about my eating disorder without shame, because I had moved past that place of shame and feeling like I couldn't tell anyone. And I wanted to encourage other people to be able to speak about these things in just a shame-free environment where they could be vulnerable and open up and not feel so exposed or embarrassed. And I also wanted people who weren't familiar, like you, Stephen, are a great example, who don't know that these things are happening all around us. I mean, we live in a society where diet culture is shoved down our throats all the time. We live just in a world of media, and all the media around us with all these messages to look a certain way and to be a certain way. And there are almost 3 million people in the United States who deal with, or in the world who deal with eating disorders. And so that's a huge number of people, and a big motivation for why that's the direction I chose to go with my book.
Yeah. And I think one of the things was so interesting was, as we were reading, because I could understand the addiction side of it, and most of the people who I did a live stream where I actually shared my testimony, and a lot of it revolves around addiction. So I was able to understand it from that perspective of looking at it and being like, wow, like this, there's a lot of commonalities kind of across the board with that. What was some of the main factors that kind of played into, obviously looking back, that kind of played into that you were able to kind of start, like seeing and being able to process?
In terms of like the content I wrote, or just in terms of like recovery and kind of moving out of my eating disorder?
Let's do the first one.
Okay. So
yeah, we'll start there.
Yeah, the content I was writing.
Yeah.
When I first started writing my book, I think that is, before I started writing, I was moving forward, and I just had it put on my heart that I was supposed to write a book, and I didn't even know what I was supposed to write a book about. And I was like, and I'm a believer in God, and I just felt like God was telling me, like, you need to write a book and you need to share your story for other people. But we all have a lot of stories that make up who we are. And so I was like, I don't know what story I'm supposed to tell. Like, what message am I supposed to put out there? And so it literally started by me just like journaling one day about how I might decide to start a book. And that journal entry later became the introduction to the first draft. It's been altered and changed and reread and content cut out of, like, a lot of different times. But yeah, that's kind of how that started. But writing the book was really a healing process for me. And I feel like that's when I started to understand what book he wanted me to write and what words I was supposed to use and what messages I was supposed to give to other people. And I had it really put on my heart to specifically talk to women of all ages, younger and older. And yeah, but once I started writing and just processing, like, I got a lot of cathartic writing out in the very beginning. And that's when I started to kind of have the vision of where I was before in my past and where I was then, and then where I wanted to be and where I wanted other people to look toward in the future too. So I would say that just sitting down and just doing it, just starting to write, even though I had no idea what I was writing about, and it wasn't consistent throughout the book. The messages were all over the place, and my first draft was just like, yikes. But getting past that and starting to look at what are the main points in here and what do I want to get across to my readers, that's when I started to be able to just notice my progress and what story I wanted to tell.
That's awesome. Yeah, because I remember when we first met, it was at the farmer's market here. And I remember my first thought was like, how is she writing a memoir? Like, how old? Like, she's not that old. Like, I know I'm older than she is. Like, what does she have to write about? And it was interesting when we actually like met together at the coffee house and we sat down and talked. And up until that point, it had been very kind of brief snippets that I had been given, and you were very open and vulnerable in that first meeting of just kind of being like, here's kind of everything that's happened. And I remember taking notes down, and you were like, I just need help with the structure. And when we got into it and we started working on it, and the farther we got into it, I remember you brought in the cardboard cereal box that you're like, and this goes to here and this connected to here. And it was just like, it was so much fun watching all of that like take place, because you were putting together things that you hadn't kind of connected before, and how it all kind of interweaved, which allowed you to create the later portion of the book in many ways. And it informed those later chapters of the book. But I'm curious because like from my end, like I watch all of this growth in my clients. I mean, you finished the first draft and you had 114,000 words when you came to me.
So many.
And then and we did manage to whittle out like 14,000 of them by the time we got through the first draft together. But it's such a different experience for me on this end, because like I'm seeing the growth, I'm seeing, how you're framing things, how you're making all of the connections and the dots and stuff. What was it like for you going through this process? Because really you're in the trench. You had been in the trenches for what, 2 years up until that point? Something like that?
Yeah, I think it was it was about 2 years since I had first like actually started a first draft. And it's hard to get through that process when you're on your own. And I listened to an interview you did with one of your other students, and she was talking about how, the accountability piece of it, how she didn't know if she wouldn't have gone through the whole coaching process and gone through everything with New Degree Press, which you work for or which you work with, like if she wouldn't have done that, holding herself accountable would have been really hard. And that's kind of where I was at before we started working together. Like I wanted to write this book and I would set aside time to do it, but I didn't have a lot of direction. And it was hard to hold myself accountable and to really have deadlines.
Yeah. And I feel that because I tell myself the same thing. I'm totally going to write this at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so, I mean, you finished it in 3 months, the completed thing.
It was like about 3-4 months around there.
Yeah. Which was phenomenal to watch happen, because the process that you were going through as a writer, because you and I had talked about like the author mentality. It takes grit, it takes perseverance, it takes determination and a willingness to learn. And then when we actually finished that first draft and you held it in your hands, and then you had to go through and mark it and scribble on it and all that kind of stuff. And then I was like, yeah, now we're going to do the author platform stuff. You jumped right into it, which was super exciting. And that's, I feel, kind of where that began to really inform the second draft, actually, when it came to who your audience was. What were some of the thoughts that you were thinking, like, as you were going through that process of figuring out, building author platform, all that kind of stuff, but in connecting with people? What did you experience when you were sharing your story with others?
Well, the number one thing I learned was that I know a lot more. I knew a lot more about my audience than I actually thought I did. And a lot of the author platform stuff that we work through, like creating an email list and landing pages and, the affirmations that are even just right below this video, like all of that stuff, I was, yeah, I was really nervous about. And I was like, man, I don't even know, one of the things that I was so insecure about is like, what do I tell someone my book's about when they ask me? Like, just the simplest things I would just overthink and stress. And that's just my personality. I am an overthinker. I'm highly critical of myself. But once we started to sit down and, I asked you, Stephen, like, well, who do you think I'm speaking to? Like, who do you think my audience is? And when you started to tell me, like, this is who I feel you're speaking to, and like what I feel your book is most about, that's when I was like, yeah, like that's exactly who I'm speaking to. But it took hearing it from someone else to really believe it for myself. Because I've always known that that's who I want to speak to. There was definitely some doubt in the process, especially when I was working on the book alone, about whether or not I was qualified to speak to this audience of people. And I've come to learn through the process that I am most definitely qualified. I'm not a specialist, I'm not a doctor, but my experience qualifies me to speak life into other people, to motivate other people, to inspire them with what I've gone through and what I know now and what I wish I would have known then. And so realizing that and just starting to work through some of those author platform things, it helped me hone in more and more on the niche of people I wanted to direct my messages to. And even now, like working through the second draft, because we're still not done with it, I have been able to cut so much content out that I initially had, because I've started to realize that although the stuff I'm cutting, it is part of my story and it is important and it has value, it's not necessarily crucial for this book and for this audience of people. And not every single detail of my life has to be in this book in order for me to get my message across.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. The dancing artist. This went back to when we mentioned that it was 114,000 words we knew when we first sat down to talk.
Yeah, a lot of that was cathartic writing. There Another thing that has kind of happened throughout the process is I think when I first started sitting down to write, I wasn't as mature as a writer at the time either. And so, there were a lot of filler words in there that weren't necessarily needed. I was saying things in a way lengthy way when I could have just shortened it down by using a couple different words. And I don't know, I think that, like I said before, there were just messages in there that weren't necessary. And because I initially did start the book out as a memoir, I was planning on telling just about every life event in the book up until this point in my life. I'm only 23, but that's the direction I was heading. And so I felt like I had to include everything, and I couldn't skip an event or something that happened with a family member. And I realized through the process that a lot of that was just cathartic writing, and it was stuff that I still needed to process and heal from. And I was getting all that off my chest. And so that's where a lot of the words came from. And, if you've ever sat down to journal or write when you are angry or just fired up about something, you can go on for pages, you can write a book almost. So that's kind of where the first draft started, and it's come a long ways.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, and you and I had talked about it, that there's such an important aspect of, especially I think when it comes to nonfiction, to when you're sharing the story of your life, you have to understand going into it that this first draft is going to be cathartic, and that a lot of it is probably not going to make it into the final draft, because you're going to have to kind of just get that stuff out. And I mean, again, like, I watched you put pieces of the puzzle together, and you were like, this is not something I had ever thought about before, but it connects to all these other things, and it totally makes sense in this way. That's the beauty of journaling, is that the kinesthetic aspect of writing it out or typing it out allows the brain to process that in just such a different way than just verbalizing it. And because then it's on paper or in front of you, and you're just like, huh.
Yeah, hence the cereal box, the back of a cereal box.
Yeah, that was so great when you come up and you just like this poor torn apart box.
I think I still have it somewhere in here, but yeah, I still have it, but it was just the back of a cereal box was the only thing I could find that was big enough for me to like start mind mapping all the ideas in the book. And that was another thing with my eating disorder, where I did some processing, was realizing all of the layers that went into my eating disorder, how it wasn't as one-dimensional as I was making it out to be in the very beginning, especially with my recovery. And it wasn't about people in my life being to blame. I used to think that it was sort of my parents' fault that I had developed an eating disorder, and it was from not receiving enough love from my dad and attention from him. And the truth is that none of it was his fault. He did the best he can, or the best he could, and he's human. And there were so many layers that went into just everything that happened, all the events that took place. And it wasn't any one cause or any one person to cause that. It was a bunch of different events and just experiences and just inward stuff that I had to deal with. That was the root of those symptoms.
Yeah. And this again was kind of going back to like the 3 months, 3 to 4 months timeline that we got the book, that first draft finishing. Is that your own story was also being unraveled at the same time. It to exactly the point that you just made. You were making all of those connections through the process. And what was interesting is that as those things came up, more cathartic writing was actually needed to address those things in particular. As you wrote. And then we would kind of go, okay, this is more cathartic, this is more just you. And I straight up told you, just like, you just write and don't ever show me what it is, because that's just between you and your journal. But like, you need to do cathartic writing for this before you even touch on it in that chapter. And because then once you were able to get it out, then you were able to say what you wanted to say. She has another question. What parts of the writing process were the most challenging for you as an author?
Yeah, so that one, I mean, there have been a lot of parts that are that have been challenging in this process, and that just have tested my patience for sure. I didn't think that when I chose to write a book that it was going to be this long of a process. I thought, maybe a year. I remember setting a goal in 2019, like, oh yeah, I'm going to finish that book I started in 2018 and get it published. And then 2020 rolled around and I was like, man, I'm not even near that goal yet. So just the waiting and just being patient and being consistent through it all has been very challenging. There's a lot of things that beg for our attention, and giving my attention to my book when it needs it most, and setting aside that time and really taking it seriously, especially when I was working before all of the COVID stuff happened. Just being diligent, like before and after work, to read through certain parts of the book, edit certain parts, meeting with you once or twice a week, Stephen, like just all of those commitments that you set for yourself. I didn't realize how time consuming writing a book was going to be. And, it's the first book I wrote, so I'm learning as I go. And another thing that was really challenging is once the first time I met with Stephen, I told him, I said, I think I have like 75% of the book done. There's still some stuff I need to talk about and put in there, and some chapters I need to write, and other chapters I need to go back and read through. And I had no process, no idea like what I was doing. And I was not 75% of the way done with the book. Like I was probably like 50, maybe 60, 65% of the way done with just writing content. But that didn't include going through and reading every single chapter, editing every single chapter, putting it into a new draft, like all of these steps that when you sit down to write a book, you don't know are included. So, yeah. And
it's in the fine print that we all sign, but we don't actually read.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, since I did have so many words to begin with, from just stuff that I had wrote before I even started working with Stephen, going through that and trying to read through all those words, like it was exhausting. I was so happy when I got done with the read through, and I'm still doing read throughs on chapters that I'm editing, but sitting down and going through that and restructuring things and putting things earlier in the book where it would make more sense, and just all that organization stuff with so many words to work through, that was really hard to get everything into their own chapter and in just in a flow that made sense. So those have probably been just the most difficult things.
Yeah, those are things that people or authors don't typically talk about a lot. And everybody's process is different. But I mean, it is very intensive when you go through the editing process to make sure that, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, to make sure it all flows the way that you want it to flow. And it takes a lot of strategic thinking. There's a lot of strategy that goes into how do you craft a good book, because you can write a great story, but you craft a great book.
Yeah.
And it's that figuring out like, oh yeah, I could do this here and I can combine that there. And yeah, that is a difficult process and no one tells you about it.
No. And I think one of the things you have to remember is it's not like you can't just settle and throw your hands up and be like, oh, like I'm done. This is too much work and it's good enough. Even though that's the title of my book, is it's good enough. Like I still, there are parts where I'm not ready to settle on them, because I'm like, I have made this commitment to write this book and to speak to these people, and I want to make my message as clear as possible. And so I think if you are writing a book, that's one of the things to remember, is that, like, as hard as it gets and as much as you want to give up sometimes, that you just have to keep like putting in the hard work and setting aside the time, because you make it past those big mountains that you feel you're never going to be able to climb. And that's how I felt when I first started working with Stephen, when I first started going through the content I had and trying to reorganize it. I felt like I was never going to get through the content I had, and it felt never ending. The process, I was like, this is going to take another 5 years. Like, I don't even know. And now we're close to submitting to publishers, and I feel just a lot more light, even though there is still a ton of work to do. Just being consistent and pushing past those hard times is super important.
Yeah, I agree. So Tiffany, and we'll get through some of the questions, and then I'll jump in on the next question that I have. And actually, before we touch on this, just as a reminder, I didn't say it at the beginning. So down below, if you wanted to connect with Carly and get 5, is it 5 affirmations or 15 or 5?
Yeah.
5 affirmations. I should remember. I signed up for the newsletter. But if you want the 5 affirmations that she created to help encourage you, really, no matter where you're at, go down. In the show notes is the link to her newsletter. And so I highly recommend that you go and you sign up. She sends out bi-weekly emails, updates on the book, the process, different things that she's learned over the course of just her journey in recovery. She has a blog where she talks about healthy posts. She makes sure that her phone is not on, that way it doesn't talk. Stupid Jarvis. And she is you're most active on Instagram, if I remember right.
Yeah, that's where I'm most active. It's hard to blog and write a book at the same time, so I'm not as consistent on my blog. I still do post a couple times a month, but yeah, and there's a lot of posts on there that you can go back and read that are still relevant. But yeah, that's where I post recipes. I just did an interview with one of my friends from Instagram who has also dealt with an eating disorder, and just heard from her and her experiences. I share, lots of smoothie bowl recipes, and then just other wellness topics and stuff related to my own health journey.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I highly recommend you guys go down, sign up. You should do it. All right, jumping into Tiffany's question. What main subjects are you targeting, and how are they divided in your chapters? Great question.
Yeah,
we spent a lot of time on addressing that.
Yeah. So the main subjects that I'm targeting are relationships with family, relationships with friends. I touch briefly on romantic relationships near the end of the book. But then I also talk about just disordered relationships. And that's not only like my eating disorder, but my disordered relationship with my parents, specifically my dad. And just I share a story of like when I moved out, why I moved out when I was 16, and how that unfolded, and how that kind of contributed to later stages of my eating disorder. And then I also share a lot of my own testimony in there, and how I came to know God and to decide that that's the way I wanted to live my life, was by just surrendering to Him. And so I share a lot of that. And then I share topics of eating disorder recovery and just overcoming perfection. If you guys have heard of the Enneagram, I'm a 1 on the Enneagram, which is a perfectionist or reformer. And that's been a huge mountain that I've had to climb in my life, is just getting over that that desire to do things right and to be good and to be perfect. And that's actually why I wanted the book to be called Good Enough, is because sometimes you just need to look in the mirror and tell yourself that you're good enough, and that what you're doing is okay, and that you don't need to keep striving to be better or to do things in more abundance. So yeah, and the book is broken up into 3 parts. So part 1 is, what did we name it, Stephen? Relationships, and I have it right here. Let's see. Part 1 is family and relationships. Part 2 is disasters and disorders, and then part 3 is realizations and transformations. So that's kind of how it's going to unfold when published.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, because we spent a good portion, a good couple of weeks kind of noodling over like how that was going to flow from start to finish, and like the themes that you address, and just everything that kind of goes into it in that structural point of view, you know, that kind of like 1,000-foot level of like, okay, what chapter goes where? Like, how do we do this?
Yeah, because before it was just all messy. I think I had some sections divided by like some dots, but there were no like chapter breaks or anything really of that sort. Yeah, except for the first few chapters. I think they had like chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, but even those ended up changing. So it really was, I mean, we focused on that for, I don't know, I think like a month.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And I mean, it's paying dividends now because I mean, you're just cruising through the second draft.
Yeah, trying to. It's hard because we did, you know, I changed the message or the audience of people I was speaking to after writing the first draft, and that's been something challenging the second time around. Is because initially it was just going to be a book of me sharing my experiences and speaking to sort of anyone who had to deal with some sort of adversity in their life, and giving hope and encouragement to those people, and just motivating them in their own journey to keep fighting and to keep working through whatever they were going through. And once I switched that to a target audience of people who had struggled with disordered eating, body image, thoughts of unworthiness, stuff of in that nature, I had to start, or I've had to the second time around, take out stuff and really meditate on things and be like, okay, is this necessary? Is this something that this audience of people needs to know? And that has been one of the challenges that I faced the second time around.
Sure. The Dancing Bardis said that was, and this was going back to what you were saying about your writing process through kind of those first 100,000 words or so of just kind of writing is, you know, she says it's really helpful tip for writing any nonfiction of this type. And if I ever write nonfiction, I'll have to keep that in mind of just being able to write, not have an expectation of that, you know, this is all going to make it in the book, but just write everything out that you need to write, and, you know, then process it and then find out the story that you really want to tell.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And a lot of authors will just tell you that you have to get through that messy first draft. Like, you just have to do it. And a lot of that might be cathartic writing. I call like the content that I had before we started meeting, I don't even consider that a first draft. I just consider that like a huge word vomit. And then when we started together, that was like really where the first draft came together. But even that was super messy, had a lot of cathartic writing in it, and that's okay. It's okay to have that messiness, to have the clutter, because you do have to get that stuff off your chest before you can make any progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Becca said, having crafted your book, what's the one piece of advice you would give to other aspiring authors? And it was followed up by working on still crafting it, and kudos for getting this far. But I think it's a really great question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think when it comes to first starting your book, my piece of advice would just be to just do it. Just sit down and do it, even if you have no idea what you're doing or what direction you're going. Just sit down and start writing something. When it comes to more tangible ideas once you get further along in the process. One thing that has really helped me is making sure that the space I'm writing in is set up for me to succeed. I don't write well if I'm in a loud environment. I've learned that having some instrumental music or classical music while I'm writing has been really useful. Making sure that I am kind of by myself, enclosed in either like an office or my room or whatever it is, but making sure that there's no distractions around me. I tend to turn my phone off, and just set up the environment either by like lighting an incense or a candle or something to just help me focus and feel like I'm in my writing element and I can really get going. And then whenever I start to hit a wall, I just take a break, whether that's like getting a snack or working out or just coming back to it a couple days later. Sometimes you need that time to just process what you're working on, especially if you're stuck. I used to just try and push past it and just force things that ended up not being beneficial in the end. And it's better if you can just take a step back from what you're working on, talk about it or journal about it, or just think about it in the back of your mind for a couple of days and then look at it with a fresh pair of eyes later on. And that's been really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, really, that taking the step back and having to not try and browbeat yourself into writing something is incredibly challenging, and it is so hard to do.
You have deadlines, like
yeah, because you're just like, what?
I have to do this. This is the only time I have to do it. Like, just brain work, just work.
Yeah, no, I feel that. I was writing on I mean, what is today? I was I think it was Wednesday. Yeah, it was Wednesday, and I had hit a roadblock, and I was just my keyboard and I were just trying to make it work. And then I was like, you know what? I'm actually going to take my own advice of not writing.
I was at the same exact place on Wednesday, so I relate.
Yeah, and it's such a hard thing to take that step back, but it's so crucial because our brains will actually process it. They will come up with a way to work around the problem. We just have to give it the opportunity to.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Alexandra says that she loves the affirmations and your smoothie recipes. So obviously have fantabulous smoothie recipes, which she has on her blog. So again, show notes.
Yeah.
Little Spooky says, "Hey."
I haven't idea who that is, but I'll just keep it quiet.
And again, if you guys have additional questions, please make sure the chat is open invitation. Carly is in the hot seat aside from just me. So one of the questions that I wanted to get to was, and you've touched on it already, but the inspiration for believing beautiful and good enough. Because I remember when you first, or when we first talked about kind of believing beautiful and then at your book, and it was kind of two separate things. And now it's kind of, they're two sides of the same coin almost. So what brought you and what really drove that message that you can believe beautiful about yourself and that you're good enough?
Yeah. So there's actually a day in it was my senior year of college. Yeah. So just a little bit ago. And I was walking from one class to another, and it was kind of a long walk, and I was just kind of dreaming in my head and thinking about, if I was to start a business one day or a brand or some sort of platform for people to come to, because originally my Instagram wasn't Believing Beautiful. It was just Carly's Counter, where I shared recipes and healthy food ideas. And that's pretty much all it was. And so I just started kind of dreaming about it with God. And the name Believing Beautiful came to mind, and I was like, what does that even mean? Like, what is Believing Beautiful? And what I started to realize through some more just focused time thinking about it is that for a lot of my life, I spent time comparing myself to other people and looking at everything that they had accomplished and just thinking like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. I could never do that. Or like, I am not good enough to do something like that. And, you know, my past disqualifies me from this specific thing. And I would just tell myself these lies. And you will hear me talk about in my book about monsters in my head. And I often refer to those negative thoughts as monsters. And there was just so much of my life where I spent time disqualifying myself and not believing good things for myself. And the message behind Believing Beautiful is that, like, I had to first start believing beautiful for myself in order to see beautiful things unfold in front of me. And the message I want other people to take from just my platforms and from my book is that you can find beauty wherever you are. You can find joy wherever you are, but you have to be the one to make the decision. And when it comes to recovering from my eating disorder, like, I had several people throughout that time span come up to me and tell me, oh my gosh, you're so beautiful. Or like my mom, I remember her just like shaking my shoulders in front of me and telling me how beautiful I was. And it, because my exterior was only a symptom of what was going on inside of me, those words held very little weight. And because they weren't something that I believed for myself, they didn't mean very much to me. And I was like, okay, cool, but I don't believe that. And it had to come from me setting aside the time and the personal growth to get to that place. And it's not something I've perfected. I still struggle all the time. But it's about like recognizing where you're struggling and being able to talk through that vulnerably and transparently, and just like question your motives. Like when I have urges to restrict my food intake, or when I start to have negative body image days. Yesterday I had a really negative body image day. Like, I have to choose to believe beautiful for myself, because no one else is going to do that for me. And I have to believe that if I want to write a book, I can do it. And I have to believe that if I want to have a family and kids one day, or if I want to start my own business, like, I can do all those things because I am able to see the beauty in the here and now. And that's kind of where the name Believing Beautiful comes from. And in terms of good enough and where that name comes from, that just goes back to me talking about perfection and how it's been something that I've struggled with. That was a big driving force for my eating disorder, to set these high expectations for me that were super unattainable, and just never reaching a place where it was good enough, not with my body and not even like with just myself, like all in one. Like, I never had a day where I was like, wow, like you're great. Like, you're good where you are. You don't have to keep striving or putting on this mask, or just expending all this energy to be this person. Like, you're good enough. And now I'm at that place where I'm like, I can look at myself in the mirror and I can say, like, you're good enough. Like, you still have room to grow, and you're still improving as a person, and you're not finished, but right here and right now, like, you are good enough. And regardless of what things you still want to accomplish or what things are still on your to-do list, like, those things are extras, but they don't define who you are. And so I wanted my message, my overall arching message of the book, to be very simple and not this complex, drawn out, like, to-do list, because that's what I'm trying to get away from. And that's where I got the name Good Enough. It came to me one day. I fully believe it was God. He was just like, good enough. Like, that's the title. That's the title of your book. And that's the message I want you and everyone who reads this book to know.
Yeah, I love that. And because there's so much power in just those two words, and with, Believing Beautiful, you and I had talked, that's really like the flagship. It is what you are about, is believing beautiful in yourself, and the good enough. And this book is simply an extension of that. But when at the very top of the stream, it was believing beautiful through trauma, through life, through disorder, and that to me was one of my favorite brainstorming sessions with you when we went through and processed that, because thinking about, and that was even before we kind of had been like, yeah, this is the people that you're talking to there. I mean, to me, it speaks to those who have been hurting, regardless of what has hurt them.
Mm-hmm.
There's that, again, like what you say in the introduction of your book. The universal truths in this book speaks to everyone, but I'm talking and I'm telling you, the reader, who is likely dealing with the same issues that I did, that you can believe beautiful through these things, which was just, I absolutely loved that. Dancing Bardess also agrees.
Thank you.
Little Spooky also agrees. And I approve of Little Spooky's pun here wholeheartedly. I've been on a pun kick as of late, as some of my friends will woefully tell you, but I absolutely love this.
Yeah.
So so we're coming to a close of not only the stream, but the of the second draft. We're looking ahead towards publishing and all the craziness that goes with that, because there's so much crazy. The crazy hasn't even started yet.
Yeah.
But what is the desire that you want people, because people are that we have the people on the stream, we have people who will find this video later, and hopefully you guys, if you know other people and you want to share this video, I highly recommend sharing it with them, because people need to hear this message wholeheartedly. What is one of the things that you have taken away from your process of recovery that you would give as a token of encouragement, and as a message of hope to those who feel stuck?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, one of the main things that I've learned throughout my own recovery is that love is an action before it's a feeling. And there will be days where you despise yourself and where you struggle to see any good in yourself, and you feel hurt or you feel broken and you just don't feel good enough. And those days are okay, and we're all going to have them. But you can still choose in those moments to love yourself, and not in the cheesy, like cliche way, but to really just like honor and value yourself, and regardless of how you are feeling about yourself. And that goes for other things in life. That goes for certain events that you're dealing with. You might not love anything about what you're experiencing in life or a circumstance that you have to deal with, but you can still choose love in that situation, even though you don't feel it. And same with joy and peace. Like, you can still choose those things. And I think, in writing my book, I don't want anyone who reads it to think that I don't want them to feel like I'm sitting in this high and mighty place and I'm totally recovered and, life is just so joyful now, because there are so many days where it's incredibly hard. And I feel like my monsters, those negative thoughts, are just corroding every single part of the day. And those are the moments where you have to lean in and you have to press in the hardest, because if you don't fight back, it goes back to like believing beautiful. If you don't choose to believe beautiful in those moments, then you won't get past them. And you have to be the one who stands up and who puts up a fight. And that was the hardest thing, is when I wanted to give up in my recovery, choosing to be strong and to stick to what I said I was going to do, which was recover. And so, yeah, I would just say on the days when you feel incredibly weak, to still choose love, even though you're not feeling it.
I love that. We had another question. So what has been the most difficult thing about the second draft? I know you were cutting things and focusing on organization, but what overall is the most difficult?
Cutting stuff is the most difficult for me. There are a lot of parts in the book that I have spent so much of my time on, things that I was so particular about, and messages where I just, I have a lot of attachment to them because of the time I spent on them and because of what they've meant in my life, and realizations that I've had that have just been so powerful. And deciding to cut those things out has been really, really difficult. And that's where Steven is really helpful, because he's able to look over the stuff that I have. And when I'm done with a chapter, I can send it to him and be like, okay, like I'm ready for your eyes to see this. And, you know, I want to know what your feedback is and what input you have and what I could do better. And he's able to, better than I am, be like, this might not be needed here. And in my mind, I'm like, no, I really want it to be needed because I worked so hard on it. So cutting things is hard when you have, you know, spent hours on them. And that's one of the things that we've kind of talked about too, is that those things that I wrote and that story that I told in the very beginning, it's not going to disappear. It's still in the first draft. We didn't like edit the first draft. We started a complete new document, so I can still go back and reference those. If I ever decide to write another book, I could possibly use those things in other books, or, you know, I could use them in my emails. And so there are still ways to use that content and not let it go to waste. But that's definitely been the hardest thing, is just trying to decide what's most important.
Yeah. And I gotta say, like, there was one of the chapters, and I mean, like, so editors, we have hard time cutting stuff sometimes, because like I've been through the process with Carly. I've watched and read the first draft and the second draft, and like the most recent one that I had done, I was going through there and I felt heartsick at the end of it, because I felt like such a jerk. I'm like, I don't think it's needed. I think you should just cut it. And I'm just like, I'm such a mean person. But it didn't match the voice and the vision that I hear when you talk about your book. And I was just like, she's worked so hard on this. I'm such a jerk.
It's all part of the process. And that's the thing, is like my eyes are so used to reading that content, and I've seen it so many times that it's hard for me to know what's not needed and what is. And so it's still hard for me after you tell me what I probably don't need, but it makes it so much easier to know which areas I need to focus on reworking.
Yeah. And then got another question. Do you see yourself writing a sequel to this book?
Yeah, I've definitely thought about writing a book on top of this one, just because there is some stuff that I'm leaving out. I also think, you know, it takes someone on average like 3 to 7 to 10-ish years to recover fully from an eating disorder. I'm only on year 3, and I think that there's a lot I have yet to learn. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of women who, when they have kids, they go through body image issues with that too. And so I know that there's a lot of things that are going to test me in my future, and things that I probably will have a lot to say about, and things that I will want to encourage other people through also. So yeah, I could see myself writing a sequel and just talking about kind of what life is like later on in my life. And Yeah. I mean, I haven't gave it much thought. It's hard because I'm like, I have so many ideas for things I want to do after the book, but I have to keep reminding myself, like, just focus on the book, like, just focus on this one thing and finish it before you start making other projects.
Yeah. Well, I think that to your point that I mean, you really had so much content that um, isn't going to make it into the second draft just because it didn't match the message that you wanted to share with people.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I've no doubt that there will come a time when you'll probably be able to use those things. And this is why I always encourage people, save your first draft in its entirety. So that way you can always go back if you ever want to see it again. And it makes it much less painful to cut stuff when you know you will always have it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's been comforting, and just to like think about the different ways I might use that content, and regardless of where it is, if it's in an email or a blog post or whatever, like just thinking about different avenues has given more creativity to it versus just like throwing it in the trash and being like, well, there goes all that hard work.
Yeah. Dumpster fire, you know. Yeah. There's definitely something that is there's a sense that it's very freeing because you know that your hard work meant something and still does, because that was the story that you had to tell before you could tell the story that you wanted to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's been probably one of the most exciting things, is watching that that progression of like, here's my story in its entirety. And it was really for yourself to better understand everything that you had gone through. And you're like, okay, now I can take all of this and hone it to speak to the people that I really want to speak to, which are people who are dealing with, you know, these disorders of eating that, you know, people just don't really understand. And I think one last question, and then we'll kind of wrap up.
Yeah.
Um, is what is maybe like the top two biggest misconceptions revolving around eating disorders that one you are addressing in the book,
Mm-hmm.
and two that you see being not weaponized but used to take advantage of people, and how they can actually come to a better place in their healing journey.
Yeah. So I would say that one of the huge misconceptions is that everyone with an eating disorder is just like super malnourished and doesn't like, just, you know, you can see their bones coming out of their skin. And that's what I think keeps a lot of people in shadows from admitting that they have an issue, is just the lack of education around what types of eating disorders there are and how they can manifest in different people's lives. And I see like that. I think that has become a weapon. And as I said earlier, I do believe that people have got better about being educated on the different types of eating disorders and what they are and what the symptoms look like. But I still think we have a long way to go. The second thing that I think could be weaponized, I had it in my head and now I have to remember. I think another big misconception is that eating disorders are one-dimensional, as in like there's one thing that's causing them to take place in someone's life. So you will hear a lot of people say that, you know, well, oh, like this person had she had an eating disorder because she was in the modeling industry, and and they're encouraged to not eat certain amounts of food, and they're required to only eat at certain times and to maintain this ideal weight. And that might be true, but there could be, and for some people, maybe their eating disorder is super straightforward like that. And I'm not the one to say, but for a lot of people, it goes up so much deeper. And the eating disorder and the symptoms from that, whether it's restricting, binging, purging, all of those things and more, those are usually related to something going on deeper in someone. And it could be related to past trauma that they haven't dealt with. It could be related to an event that's currently taking place in their life. So you never know what someone's eating disorder is caused by. And so to have that misconception that like, oh, like she doesn't eat her food because she's seeing like all these ads on TV and she just wants to be skinny and maintain this ideal image. Like that's not always true. And like for me, when I was struggling more on the side of like anorexia, my way to make myself small was me feeling insignificant and was feeling like I had to do that because I wasn't good enough and because I wasn't perfect enough. And I was trying to, and I was also dealing with a major father wound where that really hurt. And I felt like if I just made myself smaller and if I did better and looked a different way, I could hide what was happening underneath the surface. And those problems were still there and they erupted in ways that I didn't want them to. And those were things I had to go within and really process and heal through. So yeah, I'd say those are probably the two biggest misconceptions and things that I do address in the book and things that I want to kind of reevaluate and just give a different perspective on.
Yeah, no, that's so good. So I struggled and sometimes still do with anorexia, and I have never been stick thin. And then we had talked about that. Eating disorders could be linked to anxiety, not necessarily a job-related disorder. Mm-hmm. And that's what it is for the dancing Bardes. And we'll end on this note. What is something from your experience for those who are dealing with eating disorder and struggling with body image, all that kind of stuff, to help break that stigma that is around it and kind of the taboo of talking about it? What is a way that you, in your experience, have come across that others can use to address that in their own life, of talking with other people, friends, family, whoever? What's a way that they could do that to kind of help break that?
Mm-hmm. Honestly, I think asking questions is really helpful in situations like that. I don't think that diet culture or like media is ever going to change 100%. And I do think that we've seen a really big change from some companies not photoshopping every photo and just like sharing images and videos of real people and people who have stretch marks and body fat and things like that. But when you find yourself in a conversation about diet culture, or someone in your family's trying out a new fad diet, or somebody mentions something about how they feel so fat or they don't look good in any of their clothes or something like that, like you have the opportunity in those moments to change that conversation and to just like have an open and vulnerable conversation. I think of my mom who she does this stuff all the time where it's like, Mom, like, well, why do you think that? And why do you feel like you have to try this diet to lose X amount of pounds? And like, what's driving that? And why don't you feel like you can eat dinner and things like that? And so I think that asking questions to people around you who you notice are kind of like directing their exterior to who they are as a person, and they're starting to define themselves by those things, because like our body and the way we look, that it has very little weight on who we are as a person. And so recognizing that and starting just to have vulnerable conversations, and really it takes just being brave. And there is so much shame surrounding eating disorders and body dysmorphia and things of that nature, but they're real things and they need to be talked about. And that's where the transformation starts to happen, is when you are the one to take a step of faith and talk to someone. If you notice someone around you who you think is struggling, to not go and keep it hush hush and talk to someone else behind their back, but to be the one to confront them and just be like, hey, like, I noticed this. Are you okay? Or what's going on? And just be transparent. I mean, the worst thing for me was having people talk behind my back and assume that they knew what was going on in my life, and telling me I had an eating disorder before I even knew I had an eating disorder. And that stuff scarred me, and it hurt because I felt like all these people were trying to dictate for me what was going on in my life. And I would just recommend having a conversation, asking questions, even when it's hard.
That's really good. And really the second portion, or the flip side of that, is asking the question and then actually listening without preparing your response while they're talking, and not presuming you actually know anything about what it is that they're going through, but just looking at it and going like, you know what, I'm going to ask a question and I'm then going to just listen, not just to the what is said, but actually what is not being said, because what not being said is typically where the truth is in that, where they're like, I'm fine. And you're like, but are you really, and that you won't get that if you're not paying attention. And if you don't give a crap, don't ask the question, because you're just going to make it worse.
Yeah, I agree. And another thing I'll say is that I don't think it's wrong for people to want to eat healthy or like lose weight. Like I love eating healthy, and I would like to, keep my weight just at a healthy limit. But there's a healthy way to go about that, and there's an unhealthy way. And I think when it starts to get on the unhealthy side, like that's when we need to start having conversations and talking about it. But to want to nourish your body and take care of it, and just to exercise and do those sorts of things, those are all great and encouraged, but they can be overdone and done excessively. And that's what I dealt with. And what I want to make more known through my story is that there can be too much of something. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's so good. So we're going to wrap it up there. It's a great place to end it. Thank you to everybody who joined in on the stream. And thank you to Carly for agreeing to come on and be in the hot seat for a little bit. And to just talk about the book, to share, really, it's so much a message of hope. That's so much of what I've seen in this book, and why I'm so passionate about it, just because I see that hope. And you and I have talked many times that if only one person ever bought the book and it made an impact in their life, then you've done what you set out to do, which was to change someone's, way of thinking, and to help them believe beautiful about themselves and that they are good enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, guys, thank you so much. If you want to hear more from Carly and you want to follow along on her journey as she moves through finishing the second draft, moves towards publishing, and everything that goes with that, because there is a lot, then go down in the show notes. There's a link to her Facebook page. There's a link to her Instagram. There's a link to her website, which has blogs on talking about body dysmorphia, some of the other eating disorder things that she's gone through. In addition to healthy recipes, it's very green. I see lots of green. I have a deep aversion to green, but like I still appreciate everything there. And then the 5 affirmations PDF that she's created to they're affirmations that she has spoken over herself, and that she wants to give others to speak over themselves, to help them begin to believe beautiful about themselves, So I highly recommend you go down. That should be the first link down there under the connect with Carly section. So please do that. And again, until next time, guys, thank you so much. Thank you for joining, and we'll talk to you later.
Thank you.